It seems like there's also this emotional kind of revenge component to it as well. And I saw that in U.S. policy towards Iran, like because of the revolution and because of like the CIA people being taken and tortured and all of their secrets extracted out of them during the revolution. It seems like that created like a real emotional grudge among the blob members against Iran, where their policy towards Iran can't be entirely explained just by pure power maximization. It seems like there's also this irrational emotional component to it. And I worry that something similar might happen in Afghanistan, because you're dealing with this massive loss of face, this massive defeat against one of the weakest enemies in the world, against the strongest empire in world history. So the people who run that empire, I'm worried that they're going to react in this similarly irrational, emotional, vengeful way against the people of Afghanistan, simply because they're so ashamed of their defeat. I don't know. Asal, what do you think about that possibility of like an emotional, irrational, vengeful component to U.S. foreign policy against Iran, and if you think that might happen with Afghanistan as well?
I actually think you bring up a really good point. What's funny is I have been working on a report, which comes out next week, where basically I look at this sort of historical narrative of the way that the U.S. has approached Iran since the revolution that you're talking about, but more specifically since the embassy seizure and the hostage crisis that started in November of 1979. And that very point that you make, that point of sort of like humiliation, right? It was a humiliating moment for the United States. And there was absolutely a rhetoric of vengeance that came out. And the example I used was, people think like, oh, that was a really long time ago. That was like 40 years ago. In 2020, in January of 2020, after the illegal assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, by the Trump administration, by the United States, in those like few days of turmoil where everybody was scared that we were really on the brink of a larger conflict with Iran, one of the things that Trump tweeted was that he would target Iranian cultural sites. Now, the fact that that's a war crime aside, he specified the number 52 cultural sites in Iran, and that's one for every hostage that was taken in 1979. So this notion of vengeance and sort of coloring our politics being colored by ideological and sort of fanatic ideas is something we don't talk about enough. So I'm so glad, Peter, that you brought it up. Absolutely, I think you can make a certain connection to Afghanistan in the sense that, again, it's a certain humiliation, right? How can the most powerful country in the world, a country that has the largest military in the world by far, that funds its military, I mean, more than the next 10 top spenders combined, how can it lose a war? And this is why that's not the narrative, right? That's not what came out of the Biden administration. No one will ever say from these administrations, hey, we lost the war. They'll twist the narrative and make it sound like, no, we accomplished what we needed to. What that means, what we needed to accomplish will always change based on who the administration is and what sort of story they're trying to sell. But there's definitely an ideological reasoning behind a lot of our policies, which completely undermine our own national security, our own national interests. So when you have policies that undermine our own objectives, what other logical explanation do you have? Yes, it's painted to a certain extent by a certain amount of fanaticism. And I've made that point in juxtaposing the way that we deal with Iran, say, which is like the archetypal enemy. It's like, this is our quintessential enemy. And then versus, say, a country like Israel, which no matter what it does is our ally and friend. Even when Israel acts to undermine specific US policies, for instance, when the Obama administration and now the Biden administration is trying to secure a diplomatic deal with Iran, you have Israel undermining that. But we won't say or do anything that's critical of Israel. So this is not policy based in logic. This is policy that has an emotional element, that has a sort of zealous element to it. And that's something that we don't talk about enough.
Yeah, there have been multiple studies that have shown, and even written in The Economist, I was just reading, where it shows how sanctions are inherently ineffective, and the U.S. government knows that. Damn, my light almost fucking fell on my head there. But they continue that as well, because the idea that they have is that we have sanctions, we can actually help influence the government to a more pro-American style thinking. And that we know that's a failure, because when you actually starve the people, the only thing that happens is you radicalize the people against your country. Now the people are even more upset. Do you think people are dumb enough to not understand what's going on here? And this is what Assad was alluding to, the freezing of Afghanistan funds. And despite the protests that have been going on in Afghanistan over the Biden administration's actions, the Biden administration refused to do anything, which is nothing less than like psychopathic behavior. Like, like that is unbelievable, unbelievably evil. But anyway, like the article says, hundreds of protesters marched through the streets of Kabul on Tuesday to demand the United States unfreeze Afghanistan financial assets. The protesters chanted anti-American slogans. So your strategy of de-radicalizing people against America by putting these sanctions in place, you see how it fails? The protesters chanted anti-American slogans. So yeah, I'm sure that you win the people over now. You got Afghan businesses involved in this as well. You got organizers that are calling out the war criminal Anthony Blinken, as you see here. Man, this is unhinged foreign policy that we're seeing, and we're seeing resistance on that front. But Saul, see, you want to chime in? What do you want to add?
Because I want to add another point about to come back to COVID, and to add yet another example of policies that actually hurt us directly, right? Like, let's for a moment put aside that human beings are human beings, and so if we talk about human rights, we should care no matter what border they live in. But if we're only looking from the US perspective, one of the main reasons why dealing with the pandemic on a global scale is so important is because it's a global phenomenon. And so we are not protected from variants. That's exactly the situation we exist in right now, right? Why we needed to vaccinate everybody at the same time is to avoid these variants, because even though the US has so many vaccines, we're still, we're worse off now than we were when we didn't have the vaccines, to a certain extent. I mean, number of cases at least. But from the very beginning of the pandemic, this is March of 2020, February and March of 2020, we had a different administration in power. You had international calls saying not to politicize the pandemic, to lift sanctions, and to ease sanctions in light of the pandemic, because they knew for a fact that, for instance, in the case of Iran, one of the earliest and hardest hit countries in February of 2020, it was impeding the ability of Iran to import humanitarian goods, essential medicines, medical equipment, right? And this is not me saying this. This is what Joe Biden said in April of 2020. Joe Biden in April of 2020 said that despite humanitarian exemptions, US sanctions are impeding the flow of humanitarian goods into Iran. It's not just Iran, right? You look at Venezuela, you look at Cuba, you look at the blockade in Yemen that we support, you look at sanctions in all of these different places. It impedes the global fight against COVID, and that affects us. And yet we still continue with these policies. So there is a certain point where there's no logic behind it, unless, again, what outweighs public health, what outweighs, what the majority of Americans want, what outweighs what is beneficial to global security is simply the interests of certain groups and certain people in the country who push these policies, especially hawkish policies, and try to maintain these sort of adversarial relationships.